Very pleased to be able to speak to you today by video at the Screen Forever conference. The last 12 months have been tough for many Australians, and the screen industry is no exception. When COVID-19 hit and production came to a sudden halt on most film and TV sets around Australia, things looked grim for the Australian screen sector. But nearly a year down the track, the story is very different. Australian screen production is steaming ahead. For that, we can thank, first of all, everybody who works in the Australian screen sector. Rather than throwing in the towel when productions were halted and financing dried up, you quickly worked out how to reposition and get started again. Led by the Australian Film, Television and Radio School and Screen Australia, a group of industry professionals quickly developed guidelines for COVID-safe productions. At the same time, industry leaders alerted the Morrison government to a major threat. Insurers would not provide cover against productions being halted if key cast members caught COVID. In turn, without insurance, screen financiers would not release cash to allow productions to commence. We worked with industry to develop a solution, a $50 million temporary interruption fund administered by Screen Australia to fill the gap insurers would not. To date, the scheme has allowed projects with combined production budgets of over $330 million to start or restart. As COVID raged in Europe and the US, by mid-2020 it was increasingly clear that Australia's careful management of the pandemic gave us a big opportunity to attract global productions to shoot in Australia. The Morrison government moved quickly to seize this once-in-a-century opportunity, announcing in July an additional $400 million in funding to extend the location incentive program until 2026-27. Within a few weeks, we were signing up major productions. Of course, I recognise that we need to encourage and stimulate Australian productions as well as international ones. It's great if there are more jobs and opportunities for Australian key grips, gaffers and best boys, but we also want more jobs and opportunities for Australian writers, directors and producers. Attracting more foreign productions can help materially in achieving those objectives as well. First, it builds the overall ecosystem. If more productions shoot in Australia, it means a bigger screen sector and more opportunities for people at all stages of their career within the sector. Secondly, it provides opportunities for training and skills development for screen professionals on productions often bigger in scale than might otherwise be available to work on in Australia. That's why our government requires international producers receiving location incentive funding to provide internships and training opportunities. One of the 5 criteria for assessing productions covers how many Australian cast and crew will be employed and what training and skills development will be available, including internships and similar programs. Thirdly, it's important to note that some of the productions funded under the location incentive include significant elements of Australian creative control. One example is Irreverent, one of 3 scripted television series being produced in Brisbane by Universal Studio Group. Irreverent was developed by the Australian-based film and television production company Maxbox Pictures and tells an Australian story set in far north Queensland. These are important and exciting projects, and it's great to see them underway. But there is more work to do across the screen sector, and particularly in broadcasting. In my view, the fact that we've had a crisis with COVID is no reason to press pause on reform. Indeed, on the contrary, it makes the reform process even more important. And so I'd like to take a moment to give you my perspective on where we've come from, where we are now, and where we need to go. In the past decade, we've seen digital technologies drastically alter the global media landscape. Many of these changes have been positive and have included new business opportunities, efficiencies in advertising, and more compelling content options for consumers. But we've also seen challenges within our domestic market, with advertising-based business models unable to deliver the returns necessary to justify investment in many genres of media content. While free-to-air television maintains a stronghold on news and current affairs viewership, the overall audience for linear free-to-air television has declined at an annual rate of 6% from 2014 to 2019. We're now seeing people increasingly turning to online subscription services to access genres like drama, comedy action and documentary. The shift is particularly stark in younger age groups. In the first quarter of 2020, almost 70% of Australians aged over 14 used a subscription video on demand service, up from just over 20% in the first quarter of 2016. Online and on-demand viewing gives audiences the power to choose what they watch and when they watch it. And because these platforms are in strong competition with each other, they regularly release new content to attract viewers and thereby try and lock them in to their particular platform rather than having them look elsewhere. As evidence underlying this point, a recent media content consumption survey commissioned by my department found that 60% of respondents used an online subscription service to watch screen content. Only a decade ago, of course, almost all of these people would have consumed the majority of their screen content on free-to-air television. And those eyeballs in turn contributed to high ratings, in turn revenues of the networks, and in turn what the networks could pay for quality Australian content. But this business model has been fundamentally challenged by the arrival of the streaming services, with inevitable flow-on consequences for our screen production sector. So, what are we doing about this issue? Well, because the way that Australians consume screen content is changing, we need to make sure that our incentives and our regulations are changing as well. As new ways of delivering content have continued to expand the market, the government has faced a choice. We could sit here and do nothing, but the prognosis for the screen sector in Australia would be quite grim. We could sit back and simply watch while the variety of Australian content declines, jobs are lost, and fewer Australian voices and stories are heard. Alternatively, we could engage with the opportunities that change presents and set out to preserve the vibrancy and quality of the Australian screen sector. For me, the choice was very clear. We needed to lean in and take action rather than sitting back and doing nothing. The Australian screen sector, after all, plays an important role in creating jobs and stimulating the economy. Just as, and arguably even more importantly, it plays a vital role in shaping Australia's national identity and in reflecting the diversity of our population. The Morrison government is committed to the Australian screen sector, continuing to play both of these roles effectively. That's why we've chosen to take decisive action, embarking on a significant and multi-year process of industry reform. In September last year, I announced that Australia's screen content regulation would be modernised to address the most acute points of regulatory imbalance. I also announced the injection of an additional $53 million of funding delivered through Screen Australia and the Australian Children's Television Foundation to support the production of quality Australian drama, documentary and children's film and television content, and to establish a script writing and script development fund. I also announced the harmonising of the producer offset to a uniform 30% for all domestic film and television production, along with other complementary amendments to target government support and encourage the creation of screen content. In addition, our government continues to invest significantly in the screen sector, providing support through both direct funding as well as tax offsets and regulation. In 2019-20, $439 million in funding was delivered, supporting content production, the promotion of Australia as a film destination, and the training of screen practitioners. The measures that I announced last year are important, and they're designed to provide support for the industry in a particularly challenging year. But when we are seeing the scale of change that we are seeing in this industry, we also need to look at the broader regulatory environment within which the screen sector operates. That's why on 27 November last year, I released our government's Media Reform Green Paper. The reforms in this paper are intended to better support the entire Australian media sector and enhance the range and quality of services and content available to all Australians. Our aim is to place the Australian media sector on a more sustainable financial footing, harmonise the media regulatory framework and deliver positive public policy outcomes through the way that we use radio frequency spectrum. The Green Paper sets out a reform agenda for the media industry with proposals to reshape media regulation in this country, to level the playing field and make sure that quality Australian content features prominently across all platforms. Of course, we'll be engaging in two-way dialogue with the broadcasting, the media and the screen sectors to get people's views, to hear people's ideas as we develop up these proposals. As part of the reform agenda, we're proposing to introduce a new class of commercial television broadcasting licence. The proposal is that this new licence would continue to be subject to the 55% overall Australian content requirement and the new, more flexible sub-quota arrangements for children's drama and documentary content, which took effect from 1 January this year. The system would be designed to encourage broadcasters to invest in the content that their audiences want, while providing incentives for high-value production. The Green Paper also sets out proposals which would encourage commercial broadcasters to enter into multiplex sharing arrangements for their radio frequency spectrum. If they were to take up this offer, it would allow the spectrum to be used for a range of purposes, but it would also allow the funding of significant new measures supporting the media sector and the screen sector. For example, a proportion of the revenue obtained could fund public policy objectives, public policy initiatives such as the Create Australia Screen Trust, which would provide support for the continued production of Australian content. The Green Paper also contains a proposal that large subscription video on demand services, or SVODs, and advertising video on demand services, or AVODs, which operate in Australia, should be required to invest a proportion of their Australian revenues in Australian content. This proposal would support the continuing creation of Australian stories on our screens as SVOD and AVOD services grow in popularity with Australian consumers. At the moment, SVODs and AVODs face no regulatory requirement to provide Australian content, even though they're competing with commercial and subscription broadcasters who do face such requirements. SVODs currently offer only limited amounts of Australian content, and much of this tends to be older programming. We know the Australian public values Australian stories on screen and wants to see more of them. As a first step to achieving these objectives, on 30 September last year, I announced that large subscription video on demand services would be required to report to the Australian Communications and Media Authority on their investment in Australian content. What was then set out in the Green Paper builds on that initial requirement with the proposal that large SVODs and AVODs face a formal regulatory requirement to invest in Australian content. The proposal is that the obligation would apply to large services operating in Australia or targeting Australian audiences that have the reach and capacity to make a meaningful contribution to the provision of Australian content. The providers meeting the relevant thresholds would initially face a requirement to report on their investment levels. If they failed to meet the relevant investment threshold over a period of time, we would introduce a formal regulatory obligation. These reforms, as set out in the Green Paper, are significant and complex, and there will be a development process, including interaction with the media sector, the broadcasting sector, the screen sector, as we develop and refine these ideas before we're in a position to consider legislating them. I certainly look forward to working with people represented at this conference as we develop and finalise these ideas. Australia is fortunate to have a world-class screen sector with talented writers, directors, producers, actors and skilled and hard-working crew. We have extraordinary scenery and locations, great studios, and our careful management of COVID has given us another advantage in the global fight to attract our share of global screen activity. We know that the global demand for screen content is exploding, with free-to-air and subscription television, streaming services, cinemas, and many other markets for content. 2020 has been a remarkable year for the Australian screen sector. The COVID pandemic, which at first seemed to be very grim news, has turned out to create exciting new opportunities. At the same time, our government has already announced and implemented some significant reform measures for the media, broadcasting and screen sectors. And in the Green Paper, we've set out a further menu of policy measures on which we're seeking feedback from all stakeholders, including, of course, industry participants. I conclude by congratulating the creative and hard-working people of the Australian film and television sector who've leapt on the opportunities that this unlikely past 12 months has created. More strength to your arm, and the Australian government is backing you all the way.
Hi, I'm Nadine Bates, one half of Like a Photon Creative, a production company based here in Brisbane, Queensland. Welcome to Screen Forever, and I know that you'll get a massive kick out of Brave New World, the next panel up.
Well, hello and welcome to Brave New World, a panel in which we'll consider some of the enormous changes that swept through the Australian screen sector in 2020 and what they will mean for the people and companies working in it in 2021 and beyond. I'm Karl Quinn, Senior Culture Writer at The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, and I'll be moderating from my home office in Melbourne, where we're in lockdown 3.0. And a word of warning, I live beside a railway line, so you may hear the occasional rumble of a train in the background, nothing to be too alarmed about. We're blessed with quite a panel for this session. With me are Jenny Buckland, CEO of the Australian Children's Television Foundation, Fiona Cameron from the Australian Communications and Media Authority, Alaric McCausland, CEO of the Australian Directors Guild, Graham Mason, CEO of Screen Australia, Kylie Munich, CEO of Screen Queensland, and Michael Tier, President of Screen Producers Australia and CEO of Wild Bear Entertainment. Thank you all for being here. It's probably fair to say that 2020 was a year like no other for the industry. Of course, COVID upended everything, but in the screen world, it forced production shutdowns, disruptions to broadcast schedules, and the closure of cinemas. It demanded rapid responses in the way productions were made, and it has played havoc with distribution and exhibition models. But 2020 was also a year of massive change in the way the Australian industry was regulated and supported. Some of this was in response to the unique circumstances brought about by COVID, and some of it had been a long time coming and was arguably well overdue. So, to recap some of the biggest changes. In March, COVID shut down most film and television production globally and led to the closure of cinemas in Victoria for close to 8 months. In April, the government announced a suspension of Australian content sub-quotas for drama, children's and documentary on commercial free-to-air television for 2020, with the possibility of extending it into 2021. The same month, the government finally released the long-anticipated options paper, in which a range of models for reform of regulation and support of Australian screen production and content were canvassed, ranging from minor tinkering to complete deregulation. Over the next couple of months, responses to the options paper varied widely. The production sector called for the extension of Australian content obligations across all platforms, and a flat 40% offset. Free TV wanted deregulation of its platform, or at the least reduced obligations. And the SVODs argued against regulation, basically saying, trust us. In July, the government announced a $400 million extension of the Location Incentive Fund, designed to attract foreign productions to Australia, since which time 9 foreign projects worth a combined $490 million have been announced. In September, the government announced its response to the options paper, which included reduced obligations for Free TV and Foxtel, a harmonisation of the offset to 30%, and no obligations for SVODs, basically saying, we trust you. In November, the government took everyone by surprise by flagging more changes in its media reform green paper, which tried to entice the commercial FTA broadcasters to share spectrum, introduced a new point system tied to spend in a bid to encourage higher budgets, and nudged at an Australian content quota for SVODs, though still based on trust. Submissions in response to this are due by May. There's plenty more, of course, but that's more than enough to get the ball rolling. So I'd like to start by asking you, Alaric McCausland, what you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities these reforms present for the industry, assuming they go ahead.
Thanks, Karl. Well, look, I think, thank you for your summary of the events last year. I think in reflection, in particular to the announcements made in September and the release of the Green Paper, we've got significant concerns across a range of sectors. It seems to be well informed but poorly implemented. We see standing committee papers, option papers, green papers, and impact statements littered with statements about supporting Australian stories. But I think very broadly, the consensus has been that this doesn't support Australian stories. In fact, it sends us backwards. There's no doubt regulatory reform of commercial broadcasts and the disruptive SVOD and AVOD incomers has been long overdue and would support it. But there were elements within the ecosystem that were functioning very well. And this included the offset for feature production, a long-standing instrument and industry builder that had well and truly delivered on its cultural and commercial objectives. So coming out of COVID, I think certainly our members were looking for consistency and structural support. And what we thought we'd get was a carefully calibrated response across the full ecosystem. Regulatory in terms of quotas, rebates and tax offsets, and across direct funding, including Screen Australia and our public broadcasters. The government itself acknowledged that our sector in particular needs stable and effective support. The independent cinemas here were just picking themselves back up after COVID, as were Australian storytellers. I think this is a significant knock for them. And I think there's a disparate spread in terms of the focus. Certainly we've seen fast track regulation in terms of fast track deregulation of commercial broadcasters. And we've seen a reduced subscription TV requirement, spend requirement. We've seen, as you pointed out, a string of top-ups to the location offset, 400 announced last year on the back of 140 prior to that, and I think a 17 mil for Aquaman prior to that. That's close to $500 million in terms of incentives going to US studios, and probably $1 billion when you tally in the overall rebate. And we've seen an increase in the TV offset is good, but certainly one of the biggest challenges we see is the gap between deregulating the commercial networks and regulating SVODs, and the creation of a production void, the magnitude of which we're not clear on. But I do think broadly the trade-off of the 15 million a year to Screen Australia for a couple of years and the 10 million into the Australian Children's TV Foundation are good measures, but we don't know whether this is going to replace the significant tranches of local production which we think are impacted by that deregulation, and indeed the reduction in the 40% to 30% for features. And then we've got a dangling carrot of a possible Create Australia Trust in 5 years' time, subject to broadcasters coming on board with the spectrum auction. So I think overall it's just creating instability, insecurity, and we would prefer a holistic and staged presentation rather than a patchwork of reforms that we've had announced.
Michael, can I ask if you have any thoughts on the broad picture?
Well, I'm a little more optimistic than Alaric is. I understand. I mean, it wasn't ideal having the two announcements occurring out of sync, if you like. And I think that did cause a lot of angst to the industry. I mean, I think the other issue that it's not going to affect all businesses in the same way. And I do think it is going to be slightly harder for smaller businesses. My other comment is that I think theatrical films are going to be increasingly commercially and culturally important, but I also think it's some of those films can be made without Screen Australia, and I think we need to give thoughts to that, and I think we want to make sure there is as many pathways to market as there possibly can be. I think we want to keep an eye on costs as well. There's going to be a lot of I'm taking the assumption that there will be some kind of quota on the SVOD services. I am optimistic that will happen, and we'd like to see it happen quickly. Maybe there's some issues that we've got to work through. There's a lot of devil in the detail, but I'm making the assumption that will happen. And I think that, in line with the 30% offset, will be broadly additive to the sector. In some ways, it's also taking the sector into areas where the audiences want to watch the content, and I think that's particularly important. People want to watch drama on SVOD services. They want to watch it they want to binge it. They don't want to be tied to a schedule. And I think this sort of mechanism that's being proposed is a way that our content can follow the audiences onto the platforms that they want to watch this content on. I also feel that there are other sort of structural things, that there's clearly something happening in the US around cinemas, looking at what Warner Brothers have announced and HBO Max and other things. So I think, we can't sort of isolate ourselves from those sort of broad winds of change that are occurring. I think it's really important the way these changes are being implemented. I really think there does need to be particular attention over the next 4 months when the new regime begins. It seems a little bit vague or unclear that the mechanism for these processes occurring. And also, I think we really need some clarity around the SVOD quotas and the way those mechanisms are going to work, and the very specific detail that we need to kind of understand how that's going to occur. I mean, broadly, I'm supportive, but let's see how it works.
Okay. One of the things that's occurred to me over this past year is that rather than talking about a monolithic screen industry, it seems to me that we actually have in Australia a whole bunch of different sub-industries that are bound together in a complex and sometimes competing ecosystem. You see that in the tensions between producers and broadcasters, for instance. And I think you also see it in the response from government, which speaks of supporting culture, the need and desire to tell and see Australian stories. But it's also obsessed with the big announceables, the jobs, the economic activity, and so on that come from servicing foreign productions. But really, culture and jobs demand quite different responses. And I'm wondering, Kylie in particular, do you think the settings are right? Are we getting adequate support for Australian stories, or are we becoming almost by stealth an industry of piece workers for foreign productions and producers?
I think that we can support it all. I was interested to hear the Minister say then about media, broadcasters and screen as if we're not related, but we are all related and we are all in the same industry. And Screen Queensland does exist to support local practitioners, national practitioners and international projects so that we can build up the whole screen ecosystem. And for us, whether that's films, TV or games, it's just really critical that we all come together because there is strength in that.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
Well, look, I'll jump in there, Karl. I mean, I think it's one of the challenges that we note at SPA, that there are so many multiple models of funding films and there's so many elements of the sector. It is really, so what you've got to look at is what's the policy trying to do and where are they pushing and where's the opportunities. And I think it is hard because there's some people are going to do well and others not so well, and some areas are particularly challenged, and that's where the transition arrangements to the new regime become particularly important. But I think one of the things that I keep sort of banging on about is also this kind of process of how we're going to get there, because for every announcement there's 100 questions, and of course you can't answer that. We're not anticipating that. We can't read the future. But I do think there needs to be a lot of attention into this transition and how it's going to work. And one thing I do agree with Alaric is that there is a potential for a gap. And the worst thing for a producer running a production company is some sort of lack of continuity around projects. It takes a long time to paper deals. You need certainty going forward, and the sooner we can lock that in, the better, and then the industry can adapt to the new environment.
Graham, I'm wondering in what way these reforms might change the way people have to do business and make content in Australia, and will it change the perception of where the market's audiences and opportunities lie, both for better and for worse?
I think something I really agree with Michael on, he mentioned pathways to market. And I think that's the job of anyone creating content. And there's the two things you're doing there. You market as in, how do I get the money to make the show? But crucially, and I do think that we all potentially haven't been doing this well enough, is where the audience is, as Michael said. If we were still just to be making projects for cinemas or free-to-air or streamers, it's not where the audiences necessarily still are. So I think one of the things that we've all got to be mindful of, if you stay playing in that swimming pool, it is now very, very crowded. You know, you need to be looking for a different pool because that's where the water is. You know, it's that simple. So I think there's an enormous opportunity though, you know. So, and again, most of our screen community is doing very well at looking at, it isn't any longer just, will I make a feature film or will I make a scripted or unscripted piece of TV? I need to diversify my business that way. If your audience is not watching either of those, but is watching TikTok or Facebook, that's where you have to be aiming to make your thing for and fund it accordingly. So there's more content being consumed than ever before. There is way more content being made than ever before. There is so many more people trying to make content, and that's a fantastic thing, which you want to encourage. But I think any business person or creator watching this has to recognise who are you making it for and how are you going to get to them. It's
increasingly fragmented, and it's very difficult, I would imagine, for people to come up with a stock answer to that question these days.
I mean, I agree. I mean, again, I'll give a different example. I mean, I was talking to Joel Perlman, who at Village Roadshow, and they've done such a spectacular job getting out made-up stories in Rob Connolly's film The Dry. But Joel, they worked on making a campaign using the younger character storyline and did a campaign for TikTok to try and get that younger audience to come. If you had just done a normal campaign that I used to do back in the dark ages, you wouldn't have hit those kids. So you just have to make sure you're adapting for that moment. I'm not saying you have to make everything for everyone because that's ludicrous, but recognise who you're making it for and work at different partners.
Okay. It's probably fair to say that children's production has long been seen as being especially at risk in the evolving environment, in large part because of the resentment commercial broadcasters had to having to commission and screen that content. So Jenny, how do you think these changes are likely to play out for that sector? And what role do you see the ACTF playing as a commissioner or broker of content? And crucially, do you see a healthy market emerging in terms of buyers for whatever content is being made?
That's obviously a really big question that you've just asked. And I guess I'd go back to Michael's point around this not being a homogenous industry and these changes affecting some producers more than others. And it is a big shock for commercial, for producers who've had a business model that involved the commercial broadcasters screening their shows and the rug being pulled out of them, pulled out from under them. But the other side of that story is also to remember just how good Australian children's productions are. And last year was really quite a phenomenal year. The programs that are on the ABC, and particularly the Australian programs, are the most popular children's programs on the ABC. Everybody talks about Bluey, which the entire community loves. But if you look at other programs that they did across the age groups, The Investigators, The Unlisted, Hardball, these programs have done really, really well. Bureau of Magical Things has been in the top 10 programs on Netflix worldwide. And last year, Australian children's programs won Emmy Awards, they won Rocky Awards, they won all sorts of things. So there is actually huge potential for children's content. And we need to look and we need to respect what our public broadcaster is doing, because clearly they're kicking goals. NITV has very ambitious aspirations for the children's audience, and the streamers, particularly Netflix, but also the others, actually consider that Australian children's content is amongst the best in the world. So I guess I don't consider that the funding that was given to the ACTF for this 2 years is intended to kind of fund those shows that missed out on getting a commercial broadcaster commission. I hope we might persuade commercial broadcasters to look at children's content in a different way. And you'll notice that Channel 10 said last week, they axed Totally Wild, but they said we're going to have a focus on children's drama. I think we need to stop thinking about how can we put a deal together for a commercial broadcaster that is as cheap as possible and actually be pushing the high-end content that is doing really, really well for us. So we'll be putting a lot of money into development to help producers develop really, really strong concepts, and we'll be encouraging them to look towards what those companies that are commissioning children's content are wanting. And, you know, the ABC is pretty good at explaining the ambition that it's looking for, and it shows the diversity and inclusion, the different stories that have never been told before, the fact that they want to see the whole country represented. It's we'll be looking to encourage those kind of partnerships and really support them. And because children's content suffers from the fact that they don't want to pay what they pay for primetime programs, we'll be trying to use our money to make a really compelling business case for platforms to actually acquire children's content, and getting in there and helping broker those deals, but putting up decent money that's available on top of an offset, on top of an investment that you might get from Screen Australia.
Would it be fair to say that with this shift from obligation on the FTA broadcasters to commission the content to it being an option, it being something that 10 has obviously expressed interest in, the others, to the best of my knowledge, have not, that really, I mean, there's going to be attrition, surely, in the space. There won't be as much content made, there won't be as many people making it, but the demand there is for it, as you say, to be of a higher standard.
Yeah, there'll be attrition, but I also think perhaps countering that, there'll be a lot of partnerships. What we're starting to see at the moment, when people start looking at the market and what do they want, there are a lot of new young voices that are emerging in the screen sector that it's new for us, quite often want to get involved in kids' content. They grew up on Australian kids' content. They want to get involved in the space. They see it as actually being a little bit a place where they can play and do really creative content. So I think some of those established producers whose business models are changing are actually going to, you will start to see them teaming up with younger voices, giving new people a break. And I think that would be really fantastic. I hope that a bit of that kind of interaction actually happens over Screen Forever, because we are seeing a lot of really interesting players emerging in the space, and a lot of really good new ideas.
Okay, broadly speaking, it seems that the government, it's certainly the Green Paper in November, has pushed this idea that the reforms there are designed to push towards higher budgets, higher quality. But when that paper was released, I wrote a piece, which perhaps a little provocatively, I sort of floated the idea that the points spend nexus could fail, because on a purely financial basis, the sweet spot is actually about $450,000 per hour, which would get you 4 points at $112,500 per hour. Now, that may be a very reductive way of looking at it, but I wonder if you, Fiona, might be able to tell us a little bit about the mechanics of how this regulatory framework is meant to work. And are there any other levers available to encourage this desired move towards higher budget, higher quality production?
Oh, thanks, Karl. Your introduction means I can gallop through a couple of slides just to give you a bit of an idea of Quota 2021 and beyond, because quota is complex. However, Quota 2021 is less complex, but also it's easier to get. So here we've outlined what has and hasn't changed. As you've articulated, there's no individual sub-quotas for kids, drama and documentary. And this is largely brought about because, of course, the argument was harmonise that we needed to alleviate a perceived unfair burden on commercial free TV when other platforms, SVODs, were not being regulated at all. Now, of course, there's a gap, as you've also indicated, in that we don't yet know exactly how SVODs will be regulated, and we'll get to that. It's flexible, so effectively you can, as a broadcaster, get to your 250 points any which way through any which genre. As you've mentioned, the 55% primary channel requirement is retained, the multi-channel requirement is retained, the subscription expenditure has been reduced from 10 to 5%, and there's this SVOD voluntary reporting, which we'll get to. So the next slide quickly looks at a little bit of what we're on about. It's 250 points, right, you've mentioned. There's some really significant changes in Quota 2021, however. Effectively, commissioned high-budget dramas are prioritised. So you talked a little bit about what that means, Karl. I've tried to use practical examples. A Neighbours type program will get you 1.5 points per hour. As your article suggests, that will get Channel 10 about 200 points. So they're almost there in this scenario. Something like 5 bedrooms, I'm taking an educated guess here, apologies to the production companies, 5 points per hour, and Mystery Road at the top end, 7 points per hour. Now, acquired programs are no longer eligible, feature films accepted. So you can no longer just acquire a whole heap of New Zealand television drama and get significant points for it. That door's closed. You have to commission. Now, commission is defined as being meaningful and material, and the ACMA, unfortunately, has the job of determining what that is. And I think for a little while we're going to have to suck it and see. I know SPA's put up a submission that says that should be at least 30%, but does that mean it stops it at 30%? We'd like to see what it might mean in real life circumstances, but we have given an indication that we expect it to be proportionate to budget. So, you know, if you've got a $20 million budget and you're only sort of putting in 10 or 15,000 to acquire, it won't be eligible. Also, the first release requirements, 2 years from completion. So you can't buy old, again, might I say, New Zealand TV drama and hoard it and put it in down the track. It has to be 2 years from when it has been completed, which is a significant change. And docos, of course, are capped at 50 points. So broadly speaking, they're the major changes. As I've said, it's easier to get to the threshold, but it's less complicated. It can't be looked at in isolation because we are working with the SVODs to determine what their reporting arrangements are, which will hopefully lead to some form of revenue requirement. And we should talk about what that requirement should be and, of course, how it should be spent. And I'd counsel the sector to really look at who is required to contribute and invest in the Australian content scheme. At the moment, there are exemptions, such as Stan is exempt from it in the green paper. Have a look at that, and that's on the basis that Channel 9's already there doing the hard lifting. If it's a percentage of revenue, how much? At 5%, which has been flagged. If you're a streamer with $500 million revenue, that's about $25 million, recognising that commercial free-to-air television kind of on average spend about $130 million in this space. What is it that we want streamers to invest in at 5%? Is it everything, including library and including reality? Or is it specifically Australian programs? And how do you define Australian programs? There are different definitions in the Australian Content Standard. than in the Tax Act. So those things need to be looked at as well. And the devil really is in the detail here. What is it you want the streamers to spend money on? Spell it out. And how will we get that result? So I'll leave those as open questions, Karl.
Sounds like you're throwing that back on the sector to come up with some suggestions here. And I suppose there is till May to do so, right? So it's a fair bit of ground to be fought over by the sounds of things. Graham, question for you. You've got this additional $30 million over 2 years, plus another $3 million, if I remember correctly, for script development. If the Create Australia Screen Trust proposed in the Green Paper comes to be, it looks like you'll have an even bigger role to play. So can you tell us a little bit about how you might see that working? And specifically, if you could address the notion of cultural uplift and the role that might play in allocating funding and addressing the market challenges that much Australian content might presumably continue to face.
I think it goes back to things that, not surprisingly, we and my predecessors and Fiona has written speeches on this here at Screen Australia, and even the legacy agencies before that talked about. You know, it's again why we exist, and primarily we're a cultural agency. We're here to ensure that Australian stories get told and Australian stories get seen here by Australians and also internationally. We talk about it a lot, that we're a great way for Australians to reflect upon themselves and the country that we are today. And I totally endorse what Jenny says. We have amazing shows which travel all over the world, whether they be kids or factual or scripted or films. So culture's number one, always the focus. Number two is, again, creative, and it's the quality of that creativity. I think we've been trying to continue to move to ensure that we don't make projects for a particular group alone, something else I think Jenny mentioned, that we reflect the Australia that we live in. So it's not just people like me and where I live in inner Sydney. We're trying to make stuff for everybody. And then, so it's that breadth of creativity, it's careers and capability building. I'm a firm believer, again, as the Minister was saying before, about the ecosystem, particularly I would note with all the projects which are here, the larger projects, almost all of them in this moment have a huge Australian component involved in them. And beyond the component of whether they be writers, directors or people on camera, something Kylie and I both work with a lot, the amount of crew and people who make their livelihoods permanently day in, day out, you know, and that's incredible. They've got skills. They're some of the best in the world, if not the best in the world. So it's about careers. But last and most importantly, the thing that we'll continue to focus on, I'm going to bore everyone, Richard, David Tiley laughs at me sometimes, but it's about connection. How is your content connecting to the people you are making it for? I think we have not been very good at keeping abreast of those changes at both ends of who wants to pay for it and who's going to see it. So I think the big shift that you'll see in us is probably working more and more and more with all content creators to assist them to get out to the audience that they are aiming for, and hopefully more beyond that. But really, and we're not making them do it alone, we want to work with them. How can we help them connect to audiences? We do a spectacular job here. We make an amazing amount of content that people love. And I think we have to recognise, though, there is an enormous number of players, and I don't think that is necessarily sustainable, certainly off the public purse. But most importantly, to survive and sustain your business, you have to be thinking about who's going to pay for it and who's going to watch it. And that's our job, is to work with people, not say go and do it alone, to work with them. And that's what we'll primarily be doing at this moment. And especially if this the fund that the Minister has floated in the Green Paper, it would be to ensure that kids, documentaries and scripted features and high-end drama gets made. It's essential.
Is it possible to get that stuff made without something beyond the 30% offset?
Absolutely. Categorically. I mean, again, and I know I got into trouble last time I said this, and I probably will again now, and I'm sure there's people throwing things at their screens. I am not saying it's easy in any way, shape or form. And part of our job is going to be not dictating from on high, working with people for the pathways to find that money. But it's essential, if you look at us, the minister said it before in his opening address, so I didn't write down the exact number, but he was talking about the 400 million plus, which comes into the local sector every year from us and the offsets that we look after and department. That's excluding the ABC, SBS and NITV. So there is quite a lot, there was an enormous amount of support coming from the government. I think it's behoving on us to work with that. And then all the states. We have had amazing collaboration in the last 9 months of hell for the sector and everybody. And I think the ACTF and us and Ausfilm and all the states, brilliant collaboration. And I think it's our job to keep that going to help the sector make the most of the changing landscape we're all in.
Anybody else have any thoughts on the notion of, well, for shorthand, we'll call it cultural uplift and the necessity thereof?
Yeah, I think, I reflect back on the amalgamation of the AFC and FSC, which Graham is clearly very aware of, and the launch of the producer offset, the simultaneous release of the producer offset, which was designed as a commercial instrument to make up for difficulties in financing certain types of products in the market, and designed, importantly, to work in parallel with Screen Australia's direct funding, not necessarily always in concert with it. I think, particularly with the net down of the feature offset from 40 to 30%, we're going to see more direct intervention from Screen Australia rather than less. And I think that's a concern. I think since 2007, we've had a very strong, reliable, well-accepted rebate that was well used here and internationally. It delivered on its objective of keeping Australian talent here, of attracting foreign investment, of attracting private investment within Australia, and less reliance on direct funding from Screen Australia. For the life of me, I can't see why we can't continue with the rebate at the current level where that's proven extraordinarily successful, when it is a fraction, 2% of the incentives that we're providing to international studios to come down here and shoot. Great that they are for international crew capability and talent on screen, and they should be supported and ongoing. It won't last forever. The relativity of our safety versus other international jurisdictions will correct itself, as will the international facing rebates and the relativity of our exchange rate. Our challenge is to make sure that there's capacity to tell Australian stories when that boon ends. And all of this suggests that that's going to be an increased challenge rather than an improved and growing sector.
Okay, I'd just like to throw one out to whoever cares to comment. The notion of the content levy, let's call it, on the SVODs, the 5% figure that's being bandied about, which is, as I understand it, pegged to what's being asked of Foxtel. Netflix has got, on my back of the envelope calculations, revenue of about $1 billion a year in Australia at the moment. And of course, I don't actually reveal subscriber numbers or any of the rest of it, which I presume Fiona will present significant challenges in terms of auditing what they're doing and so on. But is 5% enough? Because that amounts to $50 million a year. And as I understand it, that's probably a fair bit less than they spent last year in Australia. And I know that there was probably a strategic imperative to them gearing up their spend. But in terms of taking up some of the slack that might emerge as the weight shifts from free to air to other platforms, does that amount to a contracting production sector ultimately?
Can I help frame that question? So if it was $1 billion, and that's a lot more than when we put the options paper out, and obviously COVID's happened since then, when it was probably in the order of 600 million. Lots happened since then. But if it is 50 million, let's say, theoretically, whether that's enough or not will totally depend on what you're suggesting they spend the money on. If they're able to spend it on anything, they'll say they've already done it. Library, archive, everything that's Australian. So that's where I keep coming back to, well, what is it the industry wants them to spend it on? And can you come up with some form of definition of that suits everyone and that doesn't Twitter it away?
I think it is useful to have a few frameworks around that question. The first thing I think we'd necessarily want to think about is commissioning original content, and library. I mean, I think library will become important, but maybe in the first instance we really want to know what's going into creating new content. The second thing I think is really important, and there does need to be a lot of work on, is actually what they're buying and for how long. I mean, one of the things about running a successful business is that you will have multiple business models, and you will have shows where someone's bought all the rights and you've got a nice fee and you're happy with that. And there'll be other projects where you might take more of a risk and there potentially is more upside, and it may not be realised, but you're prepared to take that. And I think that I hate to just sort of defer to kind of hammering through a lot of data, but that's actually what's going to be required, because we know these libraries have a business model where they buy content and they own it. Perhaps what we want to see is, we want shows like that, but we also want smaller shows, smaller budgets, higher risks, new players, new voices, and I think if we get the policy mechanisms right, then that will allow that to flourish. And I also think, just one other thing, I think a lot of people are going to be focused on the big one check deal, the person who's going to sign all the dollars and it'll all be done. But I also think, as is now, there's a global market, there's lots of opportunities across the globe, and we want to scour out those as well. And we'll have to bring lots of financing partners together. So we also don't want to limit our thinking. And we also want to make sure that there's some opportunity to exploit rights for the producer and for others who might invest in the content. It's a complex question, and it's probably not something we're going to immediately resolve now, but we really do need as an industry to pay a lot of attention to that.
You've got to May, no problems.
Yeah, well, exactly. Bar has some thoughts, of course. And just one other thing, the 5% is not enough. It's not enough.
Not enough.
Where our expectations got to be closer to 20%.
What was that, Kylie?
I said 5% is a very polite number. It's really not enough. It's not enough to stimulate the industry. If you're going to put regulation in place, it's got to stimulate, not stifle the industry. So I think we need to be far more ambitious with that target.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. I could ask a difficult question about what about pay? Does 5% seem like a setting that should be there for the long term? Is that an interim measure, or is that where it is now?
I think if you're asking me, I mean, it has to change. Legislation has to come through, so that is yet to happen. The announcement has been 1 July. Bit of water to go under the bridge there, but that's the announcement that has come about on the basis that, again, those traditional platforms are bearing the cost when the new platforms are not. Harmonising suggests we have to plug the holes. We've talked about plugging a SVOD hole. We've talked about plugging children's holes with some money across to Jenny, and of course culturally to Graham. So there's lots of plugging of holes to try and look at where the future will go. But of course, when is enough enough?
Okay, we're almost out of time. I'm going to throw to a couple of questions that we've got that have come in here on Pigeonhole. And the one that's top of everybody's list appears to be this. Proposed policy and procedure seems to be geared towards established content creators and distributors. What do you see as, if any at all, opportunities for new writers and filmmakers in Australia? I'll throw that to Kylie. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, it's absolutely critical that we uncover new talent, and that's part of what we're excited to do at Screen Queensland, and to work with new and upcoming practitioners. In fact, the last panel that spoke about diversity, that just shows why it's absolutely critical to find new voices and new talent. Otherwise, if we're just talking to the same people, we're going to run out of ideas and run out of content very quickly. It's my wish to see as many people reflected on screen as is true to what Australia is today.
Graham, any thoughts on that?
It's an interesting thing, and this is not meant to be provocative, but we get kicked for supporting only experienced people who are always in the club by half the industry, and we get kicked for only supporting new voices by the other half of the industry. So it's essential that we have new voices, diverse voices, inclusive voices, but brand new people coming through. It's essential we have second and third projects because it's really hard to get that career step up. And you also have to ensure that we don't become ageist and block the experience that either. So it's a juggle for all of us.
Okay.
I would say, Karl, just to add to that, I hate the thought of Graham getting kicked. But I think, the breeding ground for innovation and new faces and new talent has historically been theatrical release feature film under the producer offset. The threshold change and the net down from 40-30% is effectively killing that low budget innovative work.
Simply not true.
Well, I think we talk about, the great success of movies like The Dry, Penguin Bloom, High Ground, and Long Story Short. But talking to the filmmakers, clearly their advice is that these films would not get financed at the 30%.
And Alaric, it's simply not true. I run the offset committee. I sign it off. It's not true.
Well, this is what the filmmakers are telling us, Graham.
Well, one of the questions here is for Graham, how are you going to spend the extra funds, and what will you do about the offset threshold being raised to $1 million?
As I said before, it's the sort of thing that we're working through at the moment, and we're also looking at, as Fiona's mentioned, about suggestions into the options paper. We'll be looking, as I said, to support those projects which have the clear cultural, creative, careers connection thing. We'll be aiming to help people find the partnerships as they would best want. And where needed, we'd be coming on board. But as Jenny said, it's not just going to be using new money to top up exactly everybody who is there. It's a question of, again, making sure that we're making content for the right places and the right markets. And I mean markets as in like where is it going? How's it going out?
Okay, there's a couple of questions here that I'll conflate because they're both essentially about the same thing, which is what kind of measures could be explored or in place for attracting private funding into the market?
A 40% feature offset. And it worked very well in attracting private equity into Australian stories.
I could also dispute that, Alaric, but I won't. I'll be nice.
If I think,
should leave that one alone for now. This is a question that I think is probably for Fiona, which is about spectrum. And are you able to give us a little bit of a cheat sheet on the mechanics of how the spectrum auction proposal might work?
No, not really, Karl. You gave me absolutely no heads up there. However, I didn't think our lovely audience would be too interested in spectrum. So I know very little, but broadly speaking, obviously there is discussion in the Green Paper about commercial broadcasters sharing multiplexes to free up spectrum so that a digital dividend can be provided so the government can sell that spectrum. So is it tantalising enough? What more do the broadcasters need to share 7 megahertz of spectrum within a multiplex? I'm sure they will be making a big play for that or not.
Am I right in thinking that no figure has been put on that? No speculative figure has been put on what that spectrum might be worth?
Certainly hasn't, but it's valuable.
Yeah, okay. All right, look, we're out of time. I'd just like to say thank you all so much for participating in this, and thanks to everybody who's watched and offered up questions. I hope we got to at least a few, and here's to a much better 2021, eh?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karl.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank
Karl.
you all.
Thanks, Karl, and thanks, everyone. Well, that's a wrap for day one of Screen Forever. The chat rooms have been buzzing today, and it's so great to see many of you commenting and showing some love for the amazing speakers we've had and for engaging with the topics that are the first and foremost to be in our heads. There's a lot of meat in that last segment, and if I had a moment, I'd be starting to dissect half of the comments, but I won't. I'll keep going. We also have the results of our daily poll in, and I'm pleased to reveal that by a large margin, pivot is the buzzword we all want to leave behind in 2020. So that's it. The next 2 days are pivot-free zones here at Screen Forever. Today's poll was a bit of a fun, and we will dive into some media questions tomorrow. Best of luck to all the delegates who are pitching projects and joining our Screen Rights roundtables over the next few days. They've been at it this morning. They're continuing on now, and we'll be back tomorrow morning from 9 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time. We're kicking off with a fast-paced, high-energy, got-a-minute TikTok pitching competition, and we're really looking forward to seeing that and seeing you all back online. Now, as the Queensland folk break for a networking drink, we might as well do the same here. Hey, a prop off camera. As I said earlier, there's a lot of great action coming out of Queensland. We are missing that they're going to be having a drink without us, so I hope you will grab your own drink and enjoy yourselves virtually. And look, Queensland, there's no small part that's being done and brilliant because of the work Kylie and her team at Screen Queensland are doing. Let's see some more of that as we go out for the day, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Let's go.
And action.
Yes!
I am the protector of the deep.